Hey, what's up guys? My name is PJ and I'm back today with an Enneagram video. It's been a while since I've made a video related to the Enneagram, which is funny because I actually started my channel with the goal to only talk about the Enneagram. But what I realized in my journey and as I started sharing about the Enneagram, and I always knew this, but somehow I felt like at the beginning that I can just completely base my channel on the Enneagram and be okay with that. But as an Enneagram student, if you've ever studied the Enneagram for yourself, if you've tried to find your type and do things related to the Enneagram and use it as a tool in your day-to-day life as something in part of your self-awareness toolkit, so to speak. If you've ever used the Enneagram, you will sooner or later find out that by itself, it is not sufficient to take you to the highest levels of self-realization and enlightenment and quote-unquote salvation. It's not going to lead you to salvation by itself. That's why you need this spirituality, the spiritual path, whatever book or whatever spiritual path you follow. You need that, and the Enneagram can be a beautiful tool and a very, very powerful tool to help you and assist you on that journey. But it's not the complete roadmap. It's not completely going to lead you to the destination. And so I feel like a metaphor that's coming to my mind right now is like, let's say you have to travel from the shore to an island, and on that island, there's something that you need. There's a treasure on that island. The Enneagram is not the map of the island. It's not the treasure map by any means, but what it is, it's a boat that can get you from the shore, from where you are, from where you're standing to the island. But once you get to the island, that's when the Enneagram, in a sense, becomes useless. And that island is really the spiritual plane of existence. And for understanding the spiritual plane of existence, understanding the spiritual dimension of life, you need not the Enneagram, but you need something of a more spiritual nature. For me, that happens to be A Course in Miracles and the teachings of Jesus. For you, maybe teachings of another ascended master, like Buddha, Zoroaster, Muhammad, Krishna, and all the other paths that have been proven to lead people to the highest levels of self-realization and enlightenment throughout history. And so, nonetheless, though, the Enneagram is an invaluable tool on your journey. As I said, how valuable is that boat, no matter how small? How valuable is that tool that gets you from where you are to a much further part of the journey? So its value cannot be underestimated, hence why I'm gonna always make videos about it, because it truly was such a big important tool in my journey, and it always will be, even though I only learned about it maybe like a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. The value of it and the usefulness of it becomes very active, very imminent. As soon as you start working with it, you will see just the immense power within it. Now, having studied it for a while, now having used it in my own journey for a while, I have learned that one part of the Enneagram truly is probably the most valuable part of it and the most significant part of it, in my own estimation. I'm not saying everybody says it. It says this. In my own estimation, this section, this part, and this element of the Enneagram is truly one of the most powerful parts of this whole tool. And today I'm going to talk about that part of it. So, quick intro to the Enneagram. It's basically a shape. I'll put it up here. This shape has 9 points on it. It's a 9-pointed star. And each of these 9 points resemble a certain individual identity or personality type. So these are called the 9 personality types of the Enneagram. Each has its own name. People have called them different things. Like, for example, my type is a type 9. It's called the Peacemaker. Right next to it is a 1 called the Perfectionist. Right next to, on the other side of it, it's the 8 called the Challenger, and so on and so forth. Actually, I think it's worth mentioning the type names real quick. just because when you hear the type name alone, sometimes that causes a certain level of familiarity. Like the moment you hear the term perfectionistic or perfectionist, you're like, wait a minute, I've heard people call me that many times, you know. So type 1, as I just said, is called the perfectionist. The type 2 is called the helper. The type 3 is called the achiever. The type 4 is called the individualist. Sorry, I couldn't say that word. The type 5 is called the investigator or the thinker. The type 6 is called the loyalist. Or the skeptic. That's another name for it. The type 7 is called the adventurer. The type 8 is called the challenger. And the type 9 is called the peacemaker. And these are kind of the most well-known names for each of these types. And each of them obviously have much more to learn about. And I highly recommend a resource that I've shared in my other videos before. This resource, or it's a website, it's called the enneagraminstitute.com. Aside from all the books, amazing books that you can read about the Enneagram, a free resource is this website that I have a link of it right here and in the description box. But on enneagraminstitute.com, there are all the type descriptions in a really, really amazing way, in an organized way. They're all described, all their tendencies is described, and much more. And there's also a test. And you know, when I first started making my videos about the Enneagram, I used to refrain from suggesting people to take an Enneagram test, even though I myself had done that. That was my first introduction to the Enneagram. But I found that when you find your type through just taking a test, it never really hits home, because it wasn't you coming to that self-realization on your own from having read all the types and really sitting with the description of each type and being with that and with self-honesty and looking at all the descriptions and saying, which one really just describes me to a T? Because these types, they just get you. When you read the type that is going to be your type, that description of that type is going to be mind-blowing. You know, online they see, oh, I feel so attacked, or I feel so seen. You're going to feel so seen, almost to an uncomfortable degree, when you read your type description. It's going to just talk about all the tendencies that you know you have, and some of them you might not even be aware that you play out, but the Enneagram highlights it all to a point that you just feel personally attacked. You know, it just sees you for the truth of your personality type. Now, the reason I want to talk about the Enneagram, you know, first of all, I want to talk about the Enneagram as the main thing on my channel, but later I still want to include it in my videos, is because the Enneagram, these personality types, they're not us, okay? They are, when we say our type, that's really our ego's structure. And that's something really important and worth noting and worth getting clear about, because I see this a lot, you know, when you get into Enneagram. And this is actually why I didn't want to base my whole channel on the Enneagram, because just getting more and more familiar with your ego's structure, with your personality type structure, as helpful as it is, it's not going to let you and help you step beyond the ego as the sense, your sense of I. When you say the word I, you know, for example, I, PJ, that's my ego in a sense. It's not my spirit. My spirit is beyond dualities, beyond the personality. It's beyond the ego. And that's why the spirituality that you need to combine with the Enneagram is so important, because this spirituality is what leads you beyond the ego. And with studying the Enneagram by itself, sometimes what might tend to happen is that you get more stuck in the ego and you start being, well, I'm a type 9 and type 9s are just like this, you know, we just are this way, or I'm a type 8 and type 8s are just like this. And you basically become more identified with the ego instead of using the Enneagram as a tool to free you from the ego. And by being free from the ego, the spirit, your true self, S with capital S, you know, S, self with a capital S, sorry. Your true self, your true identity, your spirit, your Christ itself takes the place of the ego. And the ego, what the Enneagram is so powerful at doing is that it helps us clearly see the ego. And when we see our ego, it helps us be separate from the ego. Now we see the ego as this like own entity that mistakenly we have identified with, but it's not us. Our true self is beyond the ego, it's beyond the personality. However, the ego can serve as a tool for the higher self, for the spirit, for the Christ itself to use to flow into this world. So the spirit obviously is unseen. Our true self is being spirit, is unseen, is beyond the perception. And you can't just, be like, oh wow, I am spirit, and then try to like function in the world in a meaningful way. And when you're interacting with people, they're going to try to refer to you as a name, right? They're going to say, hey, PJ. They're not going to say spirit that's beyond names, beyond all words. Like, who does that? And so you need the ego, you need the personality to be able to function in the world. But the mistake sometimes tends to happen is that we get overly identified with the ego, with the personality, with the name, with the label, with the history of who we are versus tapping into a deeper sense of I. And a really, really powerful book, and I talk about this individual a lot because I've learned so much from this man. His name is Dr. David R. Hawkins, and one of his books that I'm reading currently, it's actually his second book, I believe. It's called The I, like I, of the I, like the self. I'll link it below. And this book goes really in depth about what we're talking about when we talk about the true self, the real I, beyond the personality. What are we saying? And he doesn't talk about the Enneagram, but he does talk about the spiritual nature of us, of our true self, of our higher self. And so I would highly recommend that resource to get more familiar with what are we talking about beyond the ego. What does that mean? What is lying beyond the ego? What reality exists beyond the ego? So that book is an invaluable resource to go learn more about this. But basically what I was saying is the mistake tends to happen is that we get overly identified with that ego. But like I said, the Enneagram helps us see the ego. So we see it more as like the ego becomes like a pet of ours. Like PJ is like a pet or like a tool for the higher self to use so that it can flow into the world and not only infuse our own lives with the spiritual qualities of divinity, which tends to make our lives just so much more peaceful and serene and beautiful and amazing, and just infuse it with a sense of joy and love that is actually our true essence, and it's the essence of our spirit. So when the spirit flows into our day-to-day existence, then it tends to bring with it all the qualities inherent within the spirit. So that's why we want to do spiritual work, right? Because in itself, the spirit flowing into our being, it just makes everything better for us and for everybody else in our life and who gets to interact with us. The more our spirit becomes the true sense of our I, so to speak, when we say the word I, the more we become identified with our spirit when we say that, the more it's just, our existence is just better for us, for the world, for whoever we interact with, and the realization of that inherent I, that true self, it is self-rewarding in and of itself, right? Like we have to have faith to begin the journey, but the rewards that come along with it as the result of being on the journey inherently are just so pleasurable that they give us the motivation to keep going on the journey and lessening the hold that our ego has on our self, on our true self, and allowing the spirit to flow into our existence more by loosening the hold of the ego. So the Enneagram, like I said, massively powerful to help us see the ego. Another thing and this is actually what's going to be the whole main topic of this video. I wanted to make this video in a way where if you've never heard of the Enneagram before, if you've never used it in your own life and you stumble upon this video, it's still helpful and it gives you a background of the Enneagram, just a tiny bit background of the Enneagram, but it's obviously not meant to be about the whole Enneagram, but it's about to be this section and this element of the Enneagram. So if you look on this shape, you'll notice that each type has an arrow, or each number has an arrow going towards it and an arrow going away from it. And so these are called basically the stress point and the security point in Enneagram lingo. That's what it's called. So type 9 goes, and I'm just going to use this type 9 example since it's my type, so I have the most experience with it, but this obviously applies to each type. So if you know your type, if you are going to learn about your type as a result of seeing this video and wanting to become more familiar with the Enneagram, and as a result of becoming more familiar with the Enneagram, becoming more familiar with your ego structure, you go and take that test on Enneagram Institute, or you read all the types and you find your type. When you do so, but I'm going to use the type 9 as an example, that same thing applies to each and every one of the types. So type 9, if you look at it, it goes to type 3 in insecurity. So in health, when the personality is functioning in a healthy way, it goes to type 3. When the personality is under a lot of stress and it's falling apart, so to speak, and it's just everything's just like super tumultuous around it, it goes to type 6. So what that means is the type 9, who's called the Peacemaker, who is usually tends to be a very peaceful being, maybe not internally, but externally they appear that way. They seem very easygoing all the time. Now ends up, in stress, being very skeptical and questioning and not being sure and very doubtful, like a type 6 would be. Now, they don't become type 6, they become similar to a type 6, but not the type 6, because each personality structure at its core has a certain, what's called in Enneagram language, it's called a sin. So the sin for type 6 is fear. Type 9's sin is sloth, and type 3's sin is vanity. So when the type 9 goes to 6, it's sin, the fundamental part, the base of the structure of the personality, it doesn't change. It's still sloth in the case of type 9. It doesn't become fear. So that sin doesn't change. That's why I said it starts looking like type 6, but it doesn't become type 6. So that's a small nuance that as you work with the Enneagram, you're going to become more familiar with. But nonetheless, it starts looking like type 6 in stress. In health, it starts looking like type 3. Two mistakes, well, I'll just say one mistake tends to happen very early on when we get familiar with this concept of the arrows, this integration and disintegration concept in the Enneagram language. When we get familiar with these points and we're getting familiar with the Enneagram and we're getting familiar with ourselves, the mistake that tends to happen is I, as a type 9, learn that I go to type 3 in health, then I try to act like a type 3, and I try to fake being a type 3, right? And it happens a lot, and it makes sense why it would happen, because we all want to be the best version of ourselves. We want to be the best expression of ourselves that we can be. But the ego is so tricky and so cunning. The ego is the trickster. The ego tends to say, wow, look, I just learned the Enneagram. So the Enneagram can take the ego can take a hold of any spiritual teaching. And that's what's called a spiritual materialism. The ego is like the trickster. So it can use spirituality to self-preserve itself, instead of allowing spirituality to, in a sense, vanquish its hold. The ego will fight to death to not disappear, because obviously it's like an entity. It has survival instincts, and all of our survival instincts come from the ego. But I digress. Basically what I was saying is the ego sees that the type 9, my ego being a type 9, goes to type 3, and it says, wow, what a beautiful tool for me to now fake being the integrated version of myself, being basically the healthy version of myself by faking that I'm a type 3. And it's so funny, and it's the ego is so cunning that when I first started studying the Enneagram, when I had taken a test way before I actually started studying the Enneagram, when I had taken a test, the test said I'm a type 9. I read the type 9 description. I hated it. I was like, that's not who I am. Stop insulting me. And I went about my business, and I just imagined that Enneagram never existed. Fast forward a few months or maybe a year, I started getting more curious about the Enneagram and started diving more deeply into it. And when I first read all the type descriptions, I was like, I'm a type 3. I was just dead set on being a type 3. And after a lot of self-honesty and self-realization, sitting with myself and just being very honest and truthful with myself, I was like, I'm not a type 3, but I want to be a type 3. So the ego wants to be a type 3 because it sees type 3 as good and it sees type 9 as bad, but in reality, none of these types are good or bad. And since they're neutral and they all have their pitfalls and they all have their strengths, that ultimately what we want to do is surrender to the spirit so that the spirit, God's will, so to speak, a higher will than our ego's will, starts taking a hold of our life. And we say, dear God, not my will, but thy will be done through me and through my ego as it is, and basically the spirit starts employing the strengths and the weaknesses of the ego for higher purposes, purposes that help everyone, God's will, so to speak. So I, over studying and over after self-honesty and really being inquisitive about my own tendencies, I realized that my ego indeed is a type 9. So that's the first pitfall that people tend to fall into. They learn about these arrows, and they're like, I'm just gonna act like the integration point, the security point, so to speak. That's not what these arrows are implying. And that's basically the topic of this video as to what do they really mean. Because just recently, I kind of really realized the significance of what they mean. And that realization is really what I wanted to speak about today. So what I realized is the more our spirit is in charge of our life, the more we resemble our integration point. The more that our ego is in charge of our life, and the further we are from our connection to our higher self, to our spirit, to our essence, the more we start resembling our disintegration point or our stress point. And this is so huge. Maybe not for you when you first hear it, but when you start putting these things into practice, you really realize, wow, whoever figured out these arrows really had a huge understanding of how spirit manifests itself through these different types. So in neutrality, when I'm not super pulled by my spirit, but I'm also not super pulled by my ego, and I'm just completely neutral, I am most like a type 9. The more I fall into my ego and I start following my ego's dictates, my lower self's dictates, so to speak, or the self with the small s, when I start following its dictates, the more, in a sense, my life falls apart. Because the ego loves to think that it knows what's the best way to lead our life. And it has a certain vanity about its role and its knowledge. It thinks it knows everything. It's the know-it-all kind of part of us. And the ego, when we listen to it and we completely either shut out the spirit, or we are not dedicated to having a higher will, God's will, so to speak. We're so dedicated to not having that direct our life, and we're just more dedicated to our ego. It's like our devotion is to the ego instead of being to God. The more we listen to the ego, the more we start falling apart. Sooner or later, for a while, the ego might indeed seem like a really good director and ruler of our life. we listen to our ego, and for a while things seem to be going well. The vanity of it is not really seen to us. But what ends up happening for a lot of people, and hopefully for most of us, this happens sooner rather than later. But no matter when it happens, it's a good thing. This is what midlife crisis is about. This is what hitting rock bottom is about. This is what I really think 2020 was about. It was about, let me, in a sense, shatter all the things that ego used to get security from. So when we hit rock bottom, when we kind of are at that desperation point, that's when we realize truly the vanity of ego and the ineffectiveness of its dictates. Like what it was trying to get us to do, and the way it was trying to get our lives to, the way it was trying to lead our lives, it was not the best way. And it's in that moment, like when the alcoholic, for example, hits rock bottom, when we lose the job, when we lose the relationship, when our ego's sense of security and safety falls apart, that's when we say, there has to be a better way. Dear God, if you exist, please hear me and help me and show me a better way. That's when a lot of people, and you can say it's unfortunate that it happens like this, but nonetheless, it's just, in a sense, it's a gift. It's not a curse that we hit rock bottom. It's a gift. With spiritual work, we want to, in a sense, prevent that having to happen for us to have our eyes opened. But, regardless of our desire to prevent that, it still, will happen. But in a sense, it's a gift from God to have all those things be ripped away from us, so that we can have a more increased willingness to listen to God's will, to listen to God, to listen to a higher intelligence, to listen to our spirit's dictates and allow it to guide our life, to lead our life. So what happened is we just listened to our ego for a long time. Boom. For example, for me, as type 9, I fell to type 6, right? So I just followed along with everything my ego said, and I say, yes, master, to my ego for so long. Eventually, as it always does when you listen to your ego forever, things fell apart and things fall apart. And when they do, you then you surrender, you pray to God, you say, dear God, help me. You try to make some changes in your life, because obviously you just realize that the ego's ways don't work. And you see that basically, in a sense, this stress point sometimes leads us to our security point. That's why it's like a triangle, because we oscillate between these points. That's why it's a triangle, because we in a course of a day, we might move through all of these, but sometimes each fall or ascension, in a sense, might take months or even years. So when you've been following your ego, you fall into your stress point. Now, as a result of spiritual work, as a result of spiritual willingness, as a result of praying and listening to God for guidance, you start being led by your spirit more. And when you start being led by your spirit, over time, the same way that listening to your ego for a long time led to destruction, when you listen to your spirit for a while and for a long time, and you make your spirit be the master of your life, and you allow God's will to be what sets the direction for your life, not your ego's dictates, it's like how Jesus says, Father, not my will, but thy will be done. Because when you're at that level of spiritual realization, no matter how sour the cup, you still are willing to surrender to that higher will, to that higher intelligence, because you know that at the end of the day, that absolutely knows what's best for you and what's best for the highest number of people. So when you follow God's will, everyone benefits, even if to your ego it makes no sense. So the more you dedicate yourself to that, and the more you listen to your spirit guiding your life, the more you start looking like your security point. So this is the realization I really had. is that when I first learned the Enneagram, I was trying to fake being my security point. As a type 9, I was trying to fake being a type 3. And it was my ego wanting to play. It's like the ego, let's say the ego is like an actor, right? And it looks at the script and a script of a movie and says, okay, which character is the most valued character in this movie? Let me play that, So instead of saying which character would bring out my inherent gifts and qualities the best way. So the character that it might play might not have the lead role, but it would be best for it. And at the end of the day, it's like the ego just wants to be the best, the highest, the most popular, versus being the best version of itself. So when we allow our spirit to lead our lives, we start looking our security point. So what I was saying is, when I was allowing my ego to play that role of type 3, sooner or later, I realized that I'm still in the vanity of ego. I'm still listening to the dictates of my ego. And the more I surrender to God and allowed God to direct my life, and what's super important is meditation, prayer, surrendering on a daily basis. I would highly recommend you watch my letting go video. I'll link it up here because actually I'll link another one of my videos too that says surrender is the key to spiritual power or something like that. I sometimes forget what I name my videos, but I'll link those two up here because they both talk more in depth about this. But what I was saying is meditation, prayer, and letting go, in a sense, surrendering to God's will on a daily basis. Those are like the three, like the Holy Trinity. When we do those consistently, that's when our spirit naturally starts flowing more and more into our life by us making a dedicated effort to reducing the ego's hold through meditation, through prayer, through surrendering. When we do that and the ego's hold on us lessens, the more our spirit starts being the main actor and the player of our lives. And when that happens, we start naturally looking like our security point. So it's not that we try to act it, it's that we allow our spirit to flow into our lives and then we become it, versus wanting to prematurely act like, a type 3. The moment the ego learned, let me see what the security point of my type is. Oh, okay, it's type 4. All right, I'm going to act like a type 4. The ego can be like that. But it's not how we get there. It's actually through surrender, and it's through removing the obstacles that are getting in the way from us naturally and actually looking like our security point and being our security point, in a sense, living our lives out in a way that to other people looks like our security point. So in my example, for example, I started listening to my spirit a lot more, because I kind of hit a rock bottom situation in 2020. It wasn't like rock bottom, but it was a lot of the things that my ego was based around being taken away, being ripped out of my life. And in the absence of those, I realized that I can now that my ego's safety and security has lessened over me, now my spirit has an amazing opportunity to become a bigger part of my life, a bigger actor and player of my life instead of my ego. And within that opportunity that was opened up, when you surrender, when you ask God for help, when you say your intention that I want my spirit to flow more into my life and my existence, that's when God's grace naturally starts infusing all aspects of your life. And God's grace transmutes the ego. It purifies the ego. And then your ego starts looking like the security point. So I just wanted to make this video to bring a much more higher spiritual perspective to the concept of the arrows and the points of integration and disintegration as taught in the Enneagram, because it truly is so significant and it truly provides us with a map that we can learn a lot from. When we look at those points, we can see the more my spirit is flowing into my life, the more I naturally end up looking like my security point. And the less it's flowing into my life, the more I end up looking like my stress point. And you can use that as a guiding post, as like a compass of sorts to gauge how much you're truly letting your spirit to guide you. Because your spirit wants the best for you. God knows what is best for you. So when you let God's will to guide you and guide your life and direct your path, it's not that you sacrifice anything and you lose anything of true value, because God wants to give you everything that is truly of value. And the more you trust that, and that's why faith is necessary to take the first step, to allow Spirit to guide you, to allow Holy Spirit to guide you, to allow God to guide you. It takes faith, but the faith becomes self-rewarding shortly thereafter, because God wants to show you how much better it is to listen to your spirit, to listen to Him, than it is to listen to the ego. And ego's rewards become so insignificant and so not of any significant value, because when the spirit's rewards are present, and they are just so much more truly desirable to our true self and our true being, and our lives become better in all areas, really, truly, when we let our spirit guide us. So I just wanted to encourage you to, if you know about the Enneagram, if you know your type, to look at this concept again, see it in a different way. You know, I don't want to say better way, but a different way maybe than how you've looked at it before, because I certainly know this has been a new way of looking at it for me, that I wanted to share with you. And if you haven't learned about the Enneagram, if you've never heard of it before, and if you don't know your type, I highly encourage you to give it a try. It may be something that proves helpful for you, or it may not be. But regardless, I think giving it a try may prove to be of immense value to you on your journey of self-discovery and learning more about your true self, and allowing your true self to become your true expression in this life. I think the Enneagram can truly help you. So if you're interested in learning more about it, I highly recommend checking out the links in the description box, Enneagram Institute, and the link to their test, their personality test, which is not my first recommendation in terms of how to go about learning the Enneagram, but it definitely is a quicker way. So I'll link those below. And again, if you like this video, please like it. That's how I can learn which topics are really resonating and proving to be helpful for you, so that I can make more videos related to those topics. And if you enjoyed the content that I shared in this video as well, and you want to see more videos just like this, please subscribe to my channel so that my videos can appear more on your timeline and in your feed. Again, my name is PJ. I truly appreciate your time that you just spent with me, and I hope that this concept proves to be helpful for you, as I know it was for me. And again, that is truly my only hope in sharing these videos. What has helped me, I want to share with you. So I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if it was in the comments, and I will talk to you guys in the near future in another video. Or as Phil Good would say, another one of my favorite spiritual teachers, in another version of the now. I'll see you guys later. Bye.